This is a series of chats I call the Arkansas chats um, that is about colonial America, the background and um, just context of what we're doing. It is drawn from the work about the history of the book in America. There's a set of volumes done by Hugh Amory and David D. Hall, excuse me. And it's also using a book by E. Jennifer Monahan, Learning to Read and Write in Colonial America. These are very definitive pieces, and I found that in addition to the research that's done through articles, these two books are very useful in giving background. The first discussion I'm going to have is about infrastructure. My points are that the settlement of America happened over 200 years, that there was a very rural part of it that preceded the mechanical revolution, where there were sharp regional differences that were in contrast to a kind of cosmopolitan consolidation that grew up in the 19th century, and that it moved from urban to rural. The 20th century, at the fruition of that, we needed refrigeration to have a truly urban society. Another point that's important to infrastructure is that the goods produced had to have at hand the resources first. It also had to have a distribution system. We needed also to build institutions, and we needed books. I use books as an example because they require paper, printers, regulation, and distribution, as well as people to read them and people to buy them. So let's talk about settlement first. There were three regions in the colonies: New England, Mid-Atlantic, and the southern colonies. The most work has been done on New England. If you actually ran into many book history people or early American scholars, many of them would act like there was no other place but New England. It was the place that we set up the American thinking based on. It's the center of the Ivy League schools, Harvard, which was started in 1636, is in New England, in Boston. The Mid-Atlantic colonies were much more tied to the Church of England, and the southern colonies just didn't do much with advanced work. They tended to send their children to Europe for education. So they were, that's the way they developed. They had different religious affiliations and levels of religious fervor. They had high initial literacy. The immigrants who were indentured servants were highly literate, and they made the colonies a very literate place. There was unrest and difficult travel most of the time, so the colonists stayed fairly near the coast for generations. We would assume that would grow printing, but resource shortages, a lack of booksellers, and links to Britain kept some colonies' printers tethered in some very interesting ways. If you look at the printing infrastructure of the colonial days, books to the 17th century colonists, and the 18th century for that matter, included anything printed: pamphlets, broadsides, newspapers, bound books. So if I say to you there were 100,000 books printed, that included newspapers. There weren't many paper mills until after the Revolution, and most of them were in Pennsylvania, where the first one was started. Between 1690 and 1708, there was one. 1710 to 1719, two, both in Pennsylvania. 1720 to 1729, five, three in Pennsylvania. 1730 39, eight, and so on. You see the list, 13. It wasn't until 1790 that half of the printing at the paper mills in the colonies were in Pennsylvania. The infrastructure, though, was a little bit more interesting because you could find out that the work that Raven has done on how many editions there were has found that there probably were about 500 books, and we use books lightly, that would be in a printing run. Because what would happen is you would be able to sell about 75%, and this is through subscription or at the print shop, because only a place like Boston had print sellers, Boston and New York. The rest of the places, the printer himself or herself would sell the books. Or there might be a paper mill set up near a newspaper printing press, and then that newspaper printing press would put out a newspaper and they would sell that newspaper. So in the first year you'd get 250 of 1,000 sold, and it would go down so that you would end up in 10 years selling about 75% of the run that you had, your edition, if it were 1,000. Most printers could not afford to hold on to that much copy, and so what would happen is that they would lower the edition to about 500. Now, Raven figured out that by looking at the NAIP, which is the North American Imprint series, he could identify that there were 348 editions that were printed in the decade between 1765 and 1777. No, that's more than 10 years, 1774. So of those 2348 editions, that would have been 1,174,000 books. And remember, we're thinking of books lightly. He found that using his algorithm, 714,858 were sold if he assumed that the editions were about 500. Now, this gives you some sense of the scale of the printing, the infrastructure. I want to go back to the points I made about infrastructure because there were several things that were involved in the goods produced. One of the reasons that the Stamp Act was such a big deal about got the colonists so riled is that they had extreme paper shortages, and Britain was very worried about sedition, and so they would try to control both the print that the colonists put out. They would censor their books. They also would try to keep them from getting papered. So a big part of the infrastructure, the fact that they didn't have a lot of printers and they also didn't have a lot of paper, meant that it was a difficult kind of activity to be a printer and to actually get books printed. This made it something they really wanted to do. It politicized the colonists in ways that prepared for a revolution. And I think it shouldn't be under scrutinized or underappreciated how much the technology and the way that the religion depended on the technology was important. I'll talk a little bit about that in the next one of my chats. So I'm going to sign off now.
Okay, go up, see where the red thing is up there, and choose